Thank you, John. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here, I must say. And I should also point out from the outset that I think the best reform is a reform that emanates from within. It's always the most effective and the most enduring. The problem is that local government doesn't have a strong history of reforming itself from within, and the task often therefore falls to the authority that's finally responsible for it, which is state governments. The process of renewing and reforming the important institution of local government has progressed, but as John pointed out in the session prior to the break, only at an incremental and uneven pace in most parts of Australia and New Zealand since the early 1990s. The main reason for this is the same as it is for resistance to innovation and change at all levels of government, everywhere and at all times. It is best summed up by Machiavelli's observation about the difficulties of achieving institutional reform in Europe as far back as the early 16th century. "There is nothing more difficult and dangerous," he wrote, "or more doubtful of success than an attempt to introduce a new order in any state. For the innovator has for enemies all those who derive advantages from the old order of things, and only the uncertain support of those who may be beneficiaries of the unproven new order, which is still to be successfully introduced." One can only imagine how much in furious agreement with Machiavelli Angela Merkel and other European leaders today, 5 centuries later, as they struggle to introduce much needed changes to the way that part of the world is governed. Nevertheless, as both Bill and John have pointed out, difficulty and danger are not in themselves sufficient justification for abandoning the quest for a better way of governing. Indeed, it's hard even today to disagree with the remarks of Sir Arthur Salter, a former professor of political theory and institutions at Oxford, when he said, albeit about 80 years ago in the middle of the Great Depression, that the distinctive task of our age is not to extend scientific achievement, but to improve the regulative mechanism of government, including local government, in its widest sense. The distinctive task of our age is to improve the regulative mechanism of government in its widest sense. On the 9th of August 1993, which is almost 20 years ago now, when the first meeting of the Cabinet Government's Victorian Local Government Board of Review was convened, it was as if everything else in local communities had changed except the mechanism by which they govern themselves. The great and wonderful advances in scientific, technical and managerial knowledge, which throughout the last 100 years have so radically reshaped and changed the way we work, live and relate to one another, appeared to have almost bypassed the organisation of local government itself, both in Victoria and indeed throughout Australia. In fact, for the most part, the structure of local government in Victoria in August 1993 was generally much as it had been at the end of the First World War. Prior to the 1990s, the last major reorganisation of local government in Victoria was the restructure overseen in 1915-16 by the Minister for Public Works, who merged mainly gold rush boroughs with their neighbours. Between 1993 and 1997, the most sweeping local government reforms ever made, in the judgment of Brian Gilligan from the University of Melbourne, were introduced in Victoria. A similar reorganisation of local government has now occurred in other states in Australia and in New Zealand, or is in the process of occurring. Nevertheless, the Victorian reforms of the 1990s, as I've said, are now up to 18 years old. Unfortunately, it is now apparent that in more recent years, the jockey on this black caviar of states has eased back in the saddle, and our leadership role in local government reform is now in danger of being overtaken by new models of local government emerging elsewhere. Not the least of these is the bold restructure of local government in Auckland in November 2010. As you know, this has involved the transformation of 38 councils and community boards and 262 elected members into a single metropolitan-wide governing body comprising one mayor, 20 councillors and 21 local boards with 149 local board members. It has been Australasia's largest corporate merger, and such is the apparent success that the central government in New Zealand is in the process of facilitating similar far-reaching change in the structure of local government in Wellington. It would be a pity if this summit did not fully discuss and evaluate the lessons to be learned from the way the world's third most livable city, Auckland, has restructured itself to better address significant population growth and better deal with the associated problems of planning, funding and rolling out upgrades in waste and sanitary management, transport and other infrastructure across its large and topographically complex urban metropolis. Putting the reform of local government in metropolitan centres to one side, it is the view of champions of the bush that nowhere is the need greater to develop new models of local administration and service delivery than in rural and regional areas. It is our view it is time to reignite and regenerate the local government reform process that took hold in Victoria in the 1990s, and we congratulate the MAV for leading this process. In explaining this perspective, allow me to briefly profile Champions of the Bush. Champions of the Bush is a private organisation funded by companies with substantial investments and assets, principally in regional Victoria, but also in regional New South Wales, regional Tasmania and elsewhere. They include companies like Brown Brothers in the northeast, Paddy's Foods at Bairnsdale, PFD Foods, DeBilk Wineries, SED Consulting and a number of others. These companies consider they have a vested interest in the wellbeing of regional Australia, including the wellbeing of other regional businesses and their relationship with local institutions such as local government, water, irrigation and catchment management authorities. To strengthen the capacity of regional business, Champions of the Bush has established and supervises 5 chapters of what we call the Regional Executive Forum. These exist in each of the following centres: Ballarat, Bendigo, Traralgon, Wangaratta and Warrnambool. These forums are similar to the metropolitan-based CEOs Institute or the Executive Connection or tech groups that have benefited business leaders in Sydney and Melbourne for many years. The Regional Executive Forums bring together over 50 CEOs or owners of regional businesses in 5 chapters of about 10. They meet each month to allow themselves to share their knowledge and expertise on a wide range of management matters on a very confidential basis. These businesses collectively employ many thousands of your ratepayers across a diverse range of industries, including manufacturing, retail and the service sector. I'm pleased to say that 2 or 3 local government managers have joined these forums and have found them to be beneficial as well. It's on the basis of the discussion at these forums and around the board table of Champions of the Bush that the interest in the need to push for further reform in local government is arising. Behind this is a mounting concern about the longer-term international competitiveness of regional industry, and in particular of the food and beverage industry. As I think you understand, the food and beverage industry in Australia is Australia's largest industry, much larger than the car industry or the aluminium smelting industry, for example. The food and beverage industry is Australia's 2nd largest export earning industry behind mining. And it's also an industry in which regional Australia punches well above its weight. Although regional Australia comprises about 1/3 of the nation's population, more than half the total number of food and beverage firms in Australia, excluding agriculture, are based in regional Australia. So while from an urban settlement point of view, Australia is and remains a highly urbanised and centralised society, from the perspective of the largest industry in Australia, it is a society supported by economic activity that is much more diffuse, more decentralised and regionally based than is commonly understood. a point that I think is that is well understood in local government, but not so well understood at other levels of government. To appreciate the importance of the link between regional economies, the economies your local government authorities service, and the food and beverage industry, one only has to think for a moment about who the largest private sector employers are in various regional centres around Victoria, for example. And I could do the same around New South Wales and other states, but won't for reasons of time. But in Ballarat, the largest private sector employers are Mars and McCain's. In Warrnambool, it's Midfield Meats, Warrnambool Cheese and Butter and Fonterra. In Shepparton, it's SBC. In Bairnsdale, it's Paddy's Foods. In the Wodonga area, it's Uncle Ben's. In Mildura, it's Sunbeam Foods and associated packing companies and several well-known wineries. And in many smaller centres like Tongala, it is Nestle. In Nil, it's Love a Duck. In Millawa, it's Brown Brothers. In Leongatha, it's Murray Goulburn. In the Ngambia area, it's Tabilk and so on. However, as many local government authorities from regional areas here today will understand, the food and beverage industry is struggling and the longer-term outlook is far from clear. Some of the larger players in the industry, like Heinz, have closed down their operations in Australia altogether. The Australian management of large companies like Mars and Nestle are encountering now considerable difficulties attracting funds from their parent companies for plant upgrades and new production platforms in this country. The parent companies preferring to spend this money on newer operations in Asia, Latin America or even Africa in preference to Australia. As a consequence, the international competitiveness of the Australian operations is declining, and with it the capacity to export and sell product overseas. Nestle, once a very large earner of export dollars in Australia, is now almost wholly focused on the Australian domestic market. The trend is the same for Mars. Other companies in the food and beverage industry, such as dairy companies, who incidentally are the largest users of the Port of Melbourne, are finding it increasingly difficult to purchase raw materials in the volumes they require to optimise the use of their plant. No more milk is being produced in Australia now than at the end of the 1990s. Milk production in Victoria and throughout Australia has been declining steadily since 2001-2. The reasons for this are many. They include the impact of drought and climate change, the consequences of diminished irrigation water reserves and soil degradation, and the impact of continuous cuts over recent decades in government-funded research and development programs and scientific plant and animal research, which generally has a lead time of about 25 years. I won't go into any more detail about this, but I gave a paper at an international conference on food security in Taiwan in 2009, which outlined this problem from a dairy industry perspective, and I'll leave it with John for you to access if you're interested. But while most of the reasons for the difficulties now being encountered in the food and beverage industry have nothing to do with local government, there's one important and growing constraint on the competitiveness of Australia's largest manufacturing industry that does. And this involves the provision of transport infrastructure. As Dr. Peter Brain from the Melbourne Melbourne's Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research keeps pointing out to almost anyone who will listen, investment in transport infrastructure in Australia, in all its forms, has been declining since the 1950s, and particularly rapidly since the mid-1980s. And this despite the introduction of public-private partnerships and other financial schemes in the 90s. Again, there's not a lot that local government can do about this, and if Peter Brain's analysis is correct, there's not much that other levels of government can do about it either, until we take a more flexible approach to the deregulation of our currency and financial system. But local government does have an important role to play in the provision of local roads and bridges that food and beverage companies and other regional businesses use and rely on to access raw materials and markets. And just as importantly, local government also has a critical role to play in renewing and improving the amenity and appeal of the cities and towns that employees of regional businesses live in. In this regard, the persistent problem of a significant number of councils not being able to close their infrastructure renewal gap, or the problems some regional cities are finding in responding effectively to the pressures of population growth and the need to source funds to supply infrastructure into new residential growth areas, is a concern to Champions of the Bush. Also of concern is the apparent growing reliance of many rural and regional councils on annual rate increases and charges at least 2 to 3 times the rate of inflation, and sometimes up to 5 times the rate of inflation, over an extended period of time in order to address these problems. In saying this, it is understood by your stakeholders that local government is the recipient of cost shifting and other operating cost pressures that fall outside the capacity of individual CEOs and councils to manage. But on the other hand, this is true for all businesses, and especially for those involved in the production of food. Farmers, for example, who now commonly pay in excess of $10,000 in rates per year, are exposed to the most variable operating costs of any business, in my view. These largely take the form, of course, of the vagaries and unpredictability of the weather. But farmers are also at the receiving end of cost shifting by some of the most influential cost shifters in the world. However, as price takers are unable to deal with this through passing the problem on in the form of increased prices for their product, they simply must absorb it and become more efficient by finding new ways of doing business or sell to the next door neighbour. As the co-owner of 4 farms in the Western District of Victoria, I know the problem very well. Indeed, at this very moment, I'm selling one of these farms simply because it can't be afforded any longer. There's nothing unusual about doing business this way, but it's not an unreasonable expectation that the business of local government should also be approached in exactly the same way. It's also understood that rates and charges represent only a small proportion of the total amount of money collected by government across all 3 sectors in Australia. But justifying an annual rate hike and charge in this way is, in my opinion, a bit like the shoplifter appealing for leniency from the magistrate on the grounds that he knows someone else is taking more. So what is to be done? In the last analysis, the critical issue for local government authorities in rural and regional areas is that of capacity. And not only the capacity to raise own source revenue, deliver services and renew and improve infrastructure and amenity, but also the capacity of the communities that councils serve to pay the rates and charges that are levied. In the view of Champions of the Bush, the first thing that needs to be done is for local government generally, and those that monitor and regulate it, including the Auditor-General and the Minister for Local Government, to focus much more attention on this second aspect of capacity, the community's capacity to pay. In this regard, Champions of the Bush commends the outstanding and groundbreaking work of Merv and Rowan Whelan and the development of their concept of sustainable capacity in local government. Indeed, it is submitted that this is a superior and more useful concept than the concept used by the Auditor-General to evaluate local government performance in the form of financial sustainability, the concept of financial sustainability. The AG's concept leaves out the community's capacity to pay and only focuses on a council's capacity and willingness to raise rates and charges and control costs in order to maintain sustainability. Champions of the Bush also urges the Auditor-General in Victoria and other states to review and broaden the concept of financial sustainability as it is applied to local government, to take account of Whelan's work. Indeed, in the case of Victoria, Champions of the Bush would like to see the Auditor-General apply this concept in the proposed new review of local government, which is currently scheduled for 2014-15, but which we think should be brought forward to 2012-13. The second thing to be done, in our view, is for the Minister for Local Government in Victoria to breathe new life back into the reform process in this state by strategically using her own power under the Act to appoint an independent panel to investigate the sustainable capacity of local government in specific areas and regions, and to advise her on structures and processes that would increase the sustainable capacity of local government in those areas, and how she might effectively incentivise and facilitate the establishment of these new structures and processes. This may or may not involve the merging of adjoining councils. Champions of the Bush understands that there are circumstances in regional areas, the northwest for example, where the simple amalgamation of neighbouring councils would reduce sustainable capacity, not increase it, make the problem worse rather than improve it. We also understand that in these circumstances other options need to be considered, and I'm personally looking forward to the forthcoming presentation on the Wellington-Blaney-Cabone Strategic Alliance a bit later today. The third and final thing to be done is to do more of what you're doing today. The best kinds of reform, as I said at the outset, are those reforms that emanate from within. This summit is a vital step in that process, and Champions of the Bush once again congratulates the MAV in arranging it. But we also remind you of Machiavelli's advice about the fate of innovators in institutional life. Thank you for listening.